Next month, we're going to have Dave Kofrenik. It seems like bryophytes and lichens are going to be a popular thing for our spring speakers. We have another speaker in May that's also a bryophytologist. But Dave is going to speak next month about bryophytes and lichens of Southwest Oregon. Dave has worked all over the West Coast for a really long time and is a really experienced ecologist. And I think we'll be so lucky to hear from Dave next month. I'm not going to introduce this month's speaker because I am this month's speaker. Thank you all for having me. As I am retiring from my position, I ended up doing a February talk, and I'm an ecologist working in the Rogue Basin. My name is Vanessa. I work for the Understory Initiative and have worked in the past 10 years on plant conservation and broader habitat conservation across the Pacific Northwest. It's been a real pleasure to work in the Rogue Basin specifically for the last 5 or 6 years. My first gig was down here working with Molly Morrison after working primarily in the Columbia Plateau and the Columbia Basin. I'm excited to talk to you all about the ecology of grass in the Rogue Basin. It's not just the Rogue Basin. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is globally applicable. I'm going to turn my video off so I'm not feeling so self-conscious. I'm by no means an agrologist or like a grass expert. I'm really excited about grasses, and they occupy a really huge component of our understory community. And so I think that they're really important. And I want to talk to you all about their broader ecology in the Rogue Basin. In a few months, Cindy Roche, who I think is on this meeting, is going to give a more in-depth workshop and talk tentatively, it's not all hammered out yet, about the botanical identification of grasses. So I'm going to talk about that briefly, but I'll try not to get too into it. I mean, in a short talk, how could I anyway? So overall, I wanted to talk to you all about a brief history of grasses, some basic IDs, common grasses in the Rogue Basin, some traits and lifestyle ideas that I think really help me understand which grasses are where and why. Grasses across habitat types, and maybe we'll talk about how all of that lifestyle and ecology trend fits into restoration and our practices as conservationists here. I took a lot of these pictures myself, but I tried to cite other folks. I think grasses up close and personal are really beautiful. And by photographing grasses, I feel like I was really able to understand how their features vary on the landscape. So over time, I'm trying to get rid of this bar up here. Okay, over time, grasses have evolved to really occupy open landscapes, meaning landscapes without dominant tree cover. However, they do co-occur with forested habitats. 3.5 billion years ago, sorry, that's a typo, 3.5 billion years ago, photosynthesis evolves and the first photosynthesizing species are seen on the landscape. For the next billions of years, plants evolve and are minor components of the landscape until 45 to 55 million years ago, where grasses evolve. And grasses did evolve sort of after all of the other long trajectories of plant evolution. And I'm leaving that out of here just so we don't have a really convoluted timeline. So grasses evolved 45 to 55 million years ago and do not immediately take over the landscape or become common components of terrestrial ecosystems for various global trend reasons. And 25 million years ago, the C3 grasses expand, and 10 million years ago, the C4 grasses expand. And then we really do see grasses become major components of terrestrial ecosystems. And it's interesting to think about the timing of when grasses expanded And we see the evolution of savannas and the evolution of ungulates and their relationships to abiotic factors like CO2 in the atmosphere, and global aridification and the development of seasonality. In the development of seasonality, you see, a rainy season where fire is unlikely and a dry season in some places where fire can then become a common occurrence or a more common occurrence in a dry season. After some of these climactic changes and broader global trends shift, we then see herbivore evolution following the grass dominance on the landscape. And it makes sense that herbivores can evolve after there is a food source. And a lot of these numbers are somewhat vague. People use pollen records and fossils and soil cores and carbon dating to examine pollen records and actual fossils of plant species to explore when these events occurred. And it's really important just to note that a lot of these events, the global abiotic factor changes, occurred over long periods of time, and they overlap each other, and they occurred differently across continents. And habitat type responses were variable in relationship to where a place might have been to the equator. So after the proliferation of C3 and then C4 grasses, which I'll explain in greater detail what those physiological processes are, Poaceae becomes one of the largest family of flowering plants. On planet Earth, there's over 12,000 species in Poaceae. I think the numbers sort of range from 11 to 12,000, but the point is it's one of the most numerous families of plants on the landscape, in addition to being some of the most abundant on the landscape. So when we think about just the surface of the earth being covered, by over 40% of Poaceae compared to all of the other plant families, we know that Poaceae is quite dominant. In this figure, I think I'll explain this a little bit more, but it's kind of a nice figure for showing how this huge family has branched out over time into 12 subfamilies. You can see here that there's sort of at the center of this branching, you see the first splits as as the grasses start to split out into some major groups here. And these are some ancient lineages now. At this time, you can see they haven't really expanded much over here, but they continue to branch and branch until you get two major breaks between the PAC-MAD grouping and the BOP grouping. Within the BOP grouping, you see Puoideae, the subfamily that houses Agnathma, Festuka, Colaria, Elementis, Poestis, Champsia, Bromus, Agrostis. If there's grass people in the room, it's kind of interesting to see a lot of our really common species in the same branch. And this BOP species is kind of associated with C3 physiology, which I think is interesting. That means it's grasses and plants that can historically, or can deal with higher elevations and cooler temperature and wetter weather. The C3 grasses are not as efficient with the sun's energy, but they proliferate in cooler climates. And when I think of our habitat, I think of all of these grasses in Puoideae as not actually being that cold tolerant, or I think of them as occurring in open spaces where I associate them with aridity. And they might be C3 plants that have aridity adaptations, but they primarily live in a temperate region. This is not the equator, that's not in the middle of the desert. And so they might actually make sense that they're sort of in a C3 grouping. And all of Puoideae is not C3, but a lot of them are. Another interesting grouping way over here in this super far off branch of the PAC-MAD group that are C4 grasses is the Danthonioideae subfamily, where we see Danthonia. Danthonia californica is a really common grass, and I will walk us through more of the individual grasses later. I think it's just interesting to see how some of our really common grasses can have a super disparate evolutionary history. And this is definitely a C3 grouping in the PAC-MAD branch over here. And when you see these sort of evolutionary charts of the subfamilies, there's two major groups. It's the BOP and the PAC-MAD groups. And this is from a really interesting paper about grass phylogeny. So when we think about grasses, if you're starting to wonder about them, you've ID'd wildflowers for a long time and now you're bored and you need something more challenging, you're looking at grasses and you start thinking, who are grasses? It can be kind of mind-blowing to realize, corn, rice, bamboo are grasses that take a really wide variety of forms and have this incredible physical plasticity. It's important to know that seagrass is actually not a grass, and there are lots of things labeled grasses that are not grass. I feel like things in the iris family and Liliaceae often get called grass. They're not a grass. And we'll go over some of the features that really distinguish grasses from these other families, but I won't get too into it. See, Cindy's on this call, so I will not get too into it. So what is C3 and C4 pathways? These are ways that plants assimilate carbon from the sun using oxygen and carbon in the air. And you can imagine that if plants have or grasses specifically have a unique way of assimilating carbon, or differences between different species in assimilating carbon, a shift in the global content of CO2 in the atmosphere could really impact one group, C3, over the other, C4, or the other way around. So basically, we don't have to get into the physiology. It's like very language confusing. The sun shines on the plant, and here, this picture is of a beautiful Bromus carinatus varsichensis on the coast, where the sun came out for once. And you can see the sun shining down on the plant and all of the areas on the plant where photosynthesis happen, perform the Calvin cycle, and plants diverge. Some of these grasses assimilate carbon into a 3-part compound. That's why they're called C3 assimilation pathways. And some in the other group, that's why there's 2A and 2B here as possible options for how to assimilate carbon if you're a grass, and they split it into a 4-part compound. And the 4-part compound is just more efficient with maintaining water while you are photosynthesizing. And this is why C4 grasses are more dominant in arid landscapes or landscapes with fire, like where we are. So it seems kind of counterintuitive that we have a lot of C3 plants on our landscape. And we can talk about that. It's really hard to talk about how plants have evolved and how they're distributed contemporarily with any kind of sweeping statement. So in some fashion, after they've assimilated carbon, they deal with some byproducts, and the way that they deal with those also attributes to its level of efficiency with water and oxygen and carbon. And that's all you need to know, is that carbon C3 assimilation are primarily cold tolerant grasses. They're less efficient, and so they kind of proliferate in places where other plants just kind of can't make it. And in C4 assimilation, they're aridity tolerant grasses and generally more efficient with certain resources. In the Rogue Basin, as many of you know, we have a very unique history of evolution in the basin. And this is perhaps why we see more C3 grasses. We live in an area that escaped glaciation. It's sort of a mix of an arid and temperate climate. We have a maritime influence coming in from the coast over here. We have vast heterogeneic slopes and aspects and elevational ranges that occur across the entire basin. I think I would really characterize the Rogue Basin as being heterogeneous in abiotic factors. And it's perhaps why we have so much diversity. I think a lot of ecologists in general have proposed this idea. Over 200 species of grasses likely occur here, and that's a conservative estimate. And you will see these grasses really show up in groups across different habitat types in a very patchy manner. I worked in the Columbia Basin for a long time, and it was a lot more homogeneous in some of the way that the plants and the grasses group together in response to abiotic factor and landscape features. So we have a very heterogeneous landscape and thus heterogeneous community assemblages. Vanessa, I just got here. I don't know what grasses are. I'm feeling overwhelmed. Don't worry, everyone else is. When you want to start thinking about grasses, It's really great to start with the basics. You have leaves, stems, roots, flowers, and their corresponding fruits that occur after the plant senesces, sometimes while the plant is senescing. We have a beautiful diagram here from the California Native Plant Society that breaks out some of these features, and it seems a little simple in this way until you get to some of these more specific morphological traits. And I just want to point out that some of these traits are really easy to find on the grass because you have a stem with leaves coming off. You can really distinguish where some of these traits are. In the case of looking at the flowering part of the plant, I think this is where people get overwhelmed. I will leave that to the experts to guide people through that, and do perhaps. This is a great place to really learn new botanical terms. Hopefully you're using a key that has a good glossary. And we can see here that even within these reproductive parts groupings, there are even smaller parts called florets, and there's many more parts, as you can see over here in the diagram of the actual flower. Once you start to distinguish some of these morphological traits, you begin to key from family to genus down to species, ideally using the most appropriate local flora. I don't feel like I need to explain this part too much to folks, but Festuka is an interesting example of a single genus. You use the dichotomous key to get through either or statements. There are very grass-specific terms that are ubiquitously used throughout all of the POACE key, and they ultimately link to one species. You can corroborate with a species description, and you can do this process backwards by taking a guess at a grass, reading the description, and then, it doesn't match, and you go back through the key. So this is the fun part. I want to talk more about how we can start to think about grasses and how they occur on the landscape and how we can group them in different ways to reveal more and more about their unique ecologies and their ecologies as groups. We live in a place that's pretty dominated by bunch grasses. In the next few slides, I have annual species outlined in red and perennial species outlined in blue. And you can see that these bunch grasses here are primarily perennials. And these are some of the more prolific plants in terms of establishing above ground biomass on the landscape. And so many of our native grasses are bunch grasses. So this lifestyle of being a bunch grass in some capacity is a really successful way of proliferating on the landscape. And you can see here from, if you remember, the C3 and C4 groupings, both C3 and C4 species evolved to demonstrate this perennial lifestyle and bunch grass perennial lifestyle. We do have some native rhizomatous or non-bunching grasses. They're a lot less common on the landscape. They're really cool grasses. They occupy a very different lifestyle. If you can imagine all of the structure that a bunch grass with all its tufty little leaves and its year in, year out physical form, this tiny little Volpia, for example, might show up for a few short months in the growing season and then disappear, drop its seeds and come back next year. Bromus laevites is not so much, it's a perennial, and it is only, I suspect it is less bunch forming because of where it occurs under tree canopy. It doesn't make sense to be highly acquisitive and productive with leaves in some cases. So here are some less common grasses that I just think are interesting, that have some funky lifestyles, like this Festuka mobia on the coast is a sand dune grass. Triglocan is a salt marsh grass. Melica bulbosa has these little bulbules at the bottom of its culm. Aristida purpurea is a really interesting grass that can be annual or perennial. It can be biennial. It's kind of an interesting lifestyle choice to not really be annual or perennial. Usually it ends up being some kind of short-lived perennial, but that lifestyle is opportunistic or facultative. Some of our common non-native grasses have really variable morphologies, and I'm showing the flowers of these plants today because I think this is really helpful when you're starting to look at grasses. Although from looking at the participant list, I don't know if that's necessary, but it's really great to look at all the flowers together and recognize their morphological diversity. I think almost all of these, maybe Poa bulbosa is not, but all of these, or most of these are C4 grasses. A lot of research has been done in California to establish sort of a common pattern that invasive grasses are commonly C4 grasses. And it's interesting to think that if you're a plant that can rapidly acquire water, light, nutrients, and you're efficient with them in some kind of arid time of the season, you might be a better invader or a better competitor for space outright. Phalaris arundinaceae, I think, is an exception because it's not water limited. It's kind of a wetland plant. So I wanted to just look at a few species that I think are really interesting when you wander around the landscape and start to recognize. These are also easier species to recognize for folks who are newer to looking at grasses. Is my bar showing up in this screen that are, oh, this is better. Okay, my bar went away. Agnathma lemonia is a really common grass. It's a bunch grass. It's perennial. It's commonly seen in drier terrestrial systems, but it has this unique occurrence on the landscape where you think you're in a field and it's an Agnathma field and it starts to creep into maybe a drip line or some like partial shade parts of the habitat. And it might start to look a little different. And I've always thought this was an interesting way for a plant to occur on the landscape. It makes sense that if you start growing under a tree, you might end up needing bigger leaves. So only plants with wider leaves that can capture more sunlight and that light limited part of the habitat are the only agnathrums that are going to occur. So you can see these sort of prominent awns, and this is a part of the flowering part of the grass. And these awns are sort of a distinctive part, or a distinctive feature of the Agnathma. It does have these beautiful flowers in the springtime when you can get up really close. And they have these tufts that form, and I think they have a really interesting sort of comb shape. As far as other bunch grasses grow, plant height is one of those traits that's super variable, and Agnathma, I think, really does run the gamut of medium tall to tall. And again, this can change if a plant needs to be taller to compete with other plants for light. For instance, it might have that kind of phenotypic plasticity. I'm going to try not to linger on these plants too much. Oh no, now I'm not. Okay. Okay. Skip one now. Elementis elemoides is another great grass. It's beautiful. It has this really great purple sheen to it that blows in the wind in some of these meadow and chaparral habitats that it occurs in. And then it kind of dries up in the season and also has long awns. That's where it gets its bottle brush name from when it's ripe. And it's a really great indicator if you're a seed collector, for example. And it might be a really great way to hitch a ride across the landscape if you are looking to be redistributed periodically. It's another bunch forming grass that seems to have a lot of aridity tolerance. I don't think this grass really occurs across a super wide gradient, though, the way Agnathma does. And because of that, it doesn't have a ton of plasticity in terms of its height and its blade width, as far as I can tell anecdotally. Festuka Rubra is an open canopy, drained soil, oak, meadow, savanna type of grass that has distinctively smaller awns. It's a grass that I think, because of its tuft, can sometimes get confused with Agnathma, the lemons needlegrass. And I guess I bring this one up just for the frustrated people of Earth who are wondering when the keys are going to get it sorted out for the Festuka genus. A lot of the keys are incomplete for our region. Some keys don't separate Romeri from Idahoensis. They don't break the species out in great detail. Sometimes Festuka Rubra, that is used to describe this plant, this Festuka amobia over here, thinking, you know, oh, they're purple, they're red, they're the same species or something. And it's not really that helpful in some cases. I think there are some new floras coming out that definitely break these out in greater detail, and I just wouldn't use an older flora. I think you can safely say if you are west of the Cascades, that is Romeri, and if you're on a sand dune, it is likely amobia. What's confusing is that Festuka rubra is its own separate species that does occur across a really broad landscape. It's just quite passive and not passive. It's uncommon in its occurrence. And so it can sort of slide under the radar as its own separate species that needs to be broken out. And I'll be interested to hear if other people have experience with Festuka rubra. Another way to think about plants and how they occur on the landscape is their reproductive lifestyle. Most plants outcross and use wind or some other way of dispersing their pollen in between totally separate individual plants. This is a picture in the second one of Poa macrantha, I think, cloning itself down a sand dune. And if you were to pull the bottom one up, it would have a rhizome that goes all the way up to the top. You can imagine that a sand dune might be a really harsh place for a young seed to germinate, take root, and become a mature plant. So in these dune habitats, a lot of the grasses are much more successful with cloning themselves. There's a great paper about the occurrence of bromes facultatively selfing or pollinating themselves or outcrossing. A lot of plants do this. It's not uncommon. It's a really unique adaptation, I guess, to, you know, if you want to get fresh new genetics all the time, then, you know, you outcross. And if you want to mate with someone and there's no one around, you can self-pollinate. And a lot of plants have really unique hormone sensing systems for detecting if they've already been selfed, but then they receive a deposit of new genetics. They'll terminate the self pollinated egg and support the new genetics. And then there's self-pollinating on the same plant, which is just seen visually better here. This is a carex. It's not actually a grass. Juncus, carex genuses are not, they're not, of the families are not in Poaceae, they're separate. But I think this is a great way where you can see the male plants on the top and how easy it would be to just drop your pollen down here and mate with yourself. And in a marsh system, and while carexes and juncuses are not technically grasses, they have similar lifestyles, and you know, I'm sure they all learned a lot from each other when they were evolving and had some convergence, evolutionary convergence happening. So in a water system, this is a salt marsh. You can see the likelihood of pollen just blowing around while there's tidal action happening might actually be to your detriment if you only outcross. So these plants might just have a shorter way to go in order to reproduce. So once you've gotten through all of these morphological traits and you're looking at the way the plants reproduce and the stems and the inflorescence and the height of the plant, you might start to make some general ideas and hypotheses about how plants, how these grasses specifically proliferate on the landscape. And there's been a lot of research that focuses on summarizing a lot of these individual morphological features into bigger plant traits. And it's kind of the link between the ecology and how the plants occur on the landscape and communities in response to all of the environmental variables and the actual physical organs that the plant has. Sandra Diaz, I'll have my citations at the end, is one of the scientists that I've heard talk about this work in a way that really just makes a lot of sense. There are hundreds of traits that one could focus on. These 6 traits listed here really sum up the major physiological activities that a plant is going to have. And I've tried to talk about some of these. You have your leaf, how much surface area does the leaf have and how much biomass does it really have? Are these leaves high up in the air with the flowering part of the grass up in the air, or are they close to the ground? Is the stem super dense in order to hold up a very tall plant like a tree? You might need a dense stem. And what do the propagules look like? If you have a bunch of heavy coconuts, you probably need a really dense stem. And so all of these things kind of relate to each other about how, and sort of demonstrate how the plant is living on the landscape. Oops. This is a PCA graph with some cool graphics on top. If you don't know what a PCA is, don't worry about it. It's a graph that doesn't really have data on the X and the Y axis. What you have here is all of these traits across a spectrum. I keep touching the buttons. Sorry, I'll quit moving my cursor. Well, I need to actually. So over here, you might have a large propagule. This is a little coconut. And here you have a small propagule. Here you have a large leaf, and over here you have a small leaf. Here you have a lot of nitrogen. I didn't super talk about it, but nitrogen is kind of the building blocks of the plant. So if you have a lot of nitrogen, you've really you've invested a lot in yourself as a plant from acquiring resources below ground. And you can have a tall tree over here, for example, or a short little plant over here. And this research is kind of amazing. It's really a global look at as many plant species as they could get trait records about, put into a giant database. It's the tri-db link here. It takes you to the TRI database. It's an open to the public database, so you can do your own research on any plant that's in the database. But what Sandra Diaz et al. Did was put all of these traits together and sort of graph them out. And all of these little dots are individual records for plants. And this link over here is the protocol. It's called the Green Bible. It's just like a standard protocol that the traits group put out to measure so many different traits. It's so helpful. And when they graphed all of these plants, do you have a large leaf and a ton of nitrogen? So maybe you're somewhere over here, but you're kind of short. So maybe you're down, this is the short axis, so you're down here. What they found was that this kind of all shakes out and makes sense. You've got some bigger plants over here that can support bigger leaves, bigger propagules. They have greater plant height, trees and shrubs, primarily in this group. And then over here, you have herbaceous plants. You have smaller leaves compared to like a giant palm, for example, and maybe smaller propagules, but it's, some of them are bigger than others. I think what's great about this work is you can really see that it's important to consider the lifestyle of any given study species within the broader context of its, global counterparts. When I think of a grass as having big, juicy leaves, it's because I've looked at tiny little nothings all day. And it's important for me to think about what is an actual really big leaf, like a monstera leaf compared to a tiny little, pea leaf or something. After you've started to get some of these plant traits kicking around in your mind, then people start thinking, how does that all add up? And I think an interesting idea to sort of framework this into is the Grimes's triangle idea, where you have, competitive plants that really acquire nutrients really fast and they grab water really fast. These are a lot of our invasive grasses. They acquire a lot and are rapidly growing in the wintertime. Or are you a stress tolerant grass? So if you're like a perennial bunch grass that can really wait out the summer heat and just metabolically regulate your processes to withstand aridity, a lot of direct sunlight, you might be a stress tolerator. And then ruderol species are species that respond to disturbance, like fire or browsing or digging or something. And, within this framework, most grasses don't fit squarely in any one category. They occur really in kind of like this, where you see them occur in a spectrum. And so these are hypothetical spectrums, right? I haven't looked up where Festuka Rubra, and here I'm using 6-letter codes just to be transparent. Festuka Rubra is a 6-letter code that you use to identify the species without having to spell it out super obviously. And I suspect Agnathma is somewhere in the middle, right? It does kind of acquire a lot and put a lot of it below ground. So if you've ever grown Agnathma, it takes 3 years to show up, but it really does acquire a lot below ground and really develops a long, fibrous, perennial grassroot system. But it also tolerates fire really well because of this. So it's somewhat ruderal, and it does have some kind of tolerator physiology for the open sun and aridity. And Colaria macrantha, I kind of took a stab here at what I think it would be. It's somewhere between a ruderal and a stress tolerator. It's not much of an acquisitor. It's not that competitive, but it does occur on the landscape. And another way to break these things out is to really think about, the habitat type. And I've been trying to talk about some of this to lay the groundwork. But when you start to break habitats out into dry and wet, closed and open canopy, and I would add here, some kind of soil type metric, you really are characterizing the basic things that a plant needs, which is sun, water, and nutritional uptake in order to build their organs and proliferate on the landscape. And I have a few pictures here of some interesting places where you could kind of game this out. If you are in a dry habitat here, I think this is from the Mariposa. No, this is from the Britt Trails Park. There's actually a really great Festuka patch right in the middle of that forest park by Britt. It's like really crazy. It's really tall for some freaky reason. It's in broad open sunlight and shouldn't really need to compete for height to acquire like light over other plants, but for some reason this population is quite tall. I don't think this picture really does it justice. And here's a place in the Little Butte watershed that has some ephemeral wetness, these sort of ground seeps that occur in the Klamath-Siskiyou region that kind of remind me never to assume that because something is an open system, it is a dry system. Some of these ephemerally wet systems, this place, actually Christy would know about this place. It's the Crooks property and has this crazy camas bloom that happens sort of on the top of a mountain in the summertime. It's very unassuming. And then it dries right up. And so trying to figure out, what kind of grass ecology would be happening here when we were developing a seed mix was somewhat challenging. And then here you have more of a mixed canopy situation where there's some small trees, some larger overstory trees, some topography and divots and stuff. And just painting the picture for our regional heterogeneity across the landscape. So I wanted to look closer at the leaves of some of these plants that occur in these different categories that I've broken out in a really, that's a very basic breakout of, these are not really the technical habitat categories that anyone would use to really describe the landscape. But if you're doing sort of a decision tree approach where you ask, is it dry or is it wet? Are there trees or are there no trees? Does it burn or doesn't it? Is it cattle or wasn't it? You kind of start to suss out the nature of a system. And in open canopy, where we have some of these, and I've highlighted the Agnathma just because I love it. Here, this is the Agnathma in here. In an open canopy, sunlight's not really a problem. You get a lot of photosynthetic opportunities, so it doesn't really make sense to have super wide leaves. In a closed canopy situation, this Festuka californica, that's kind of an understory, tree understory plant, has much wider leaves. In an open canopy wet area, even the Danthonian doesn't have as wide of the leaves of this agrostis species over here. And it's just kind of an interesting trend when you think about where the plants are situated on the landscape. their evolution has responded. And within these traits, there's lots of phenotypic plasticity. I'll just keep saying that. But you do see some general trends in the way that these plants have evolved. So as I've mentioned, the context really matters. And if you are trying, this is kind of the restoration angle and how to interact with these plants. If you're a land manager or a private landowner or somebody who's interested in encouraging the proliferation of grasses on the landscape, you characterize your site, you do some kind of procedure development about what you're going to do on the landscape and probably think that over for a good long while, and then do some treatment implementation and some observation afterwards. And then you do this over and over again. TUI, the group that I work for, has started tinkering with some of these different ways of interacting with the landscape. And we're starting to do these trait analyses to take what we see as, just where the plants are and in what quantity, and plug them into these trait analyses to really start to see. And we started to see actually that, certain plants respond really fast. And in time, we suspect that these long-lived, slower growing plants will respond more slowly. There are rapid responses and long-term responses. So here you can see we're growing Poa secunda in a field, and it just goes buck wild when you water it. And here, some understory burning. It's happening in a very bromus diandrous infested understory, and it's going up real fast. And you can see that the surface burn is actually like really going there. And this area had a lot of rapid take from our seed mix of annuals. So you have this sort of flashy disturbance, and the rapidly acquiring plants took faster. And hopefully some of our native grasses will show up in the next 3 to 5 years. Here we have like a unique divot treatment that, I initially saw Charlie Shells suggest this in the monument just to kind of emulate moose hoofs. And you can see that outside of this divot, not a lot of plants made it. But here you have like almost 50% or 60% wildflower take, and then like a 40%, which is kind of a crazy like nail on the head mix expression of what we put in our mix. Whoever germinated really remembered my ratio, 60-40 or whatever. And these plants likely had some kind of relief from the environmental factors. This is up at Vesper Meadow. And in here, you might have a little bit of solar radiation relief. And you might have a little bit more water retention. And there's a little thatch layer here that these plants were able to bypass by being in a ditch. We do a lot of this hand removal. This is some wheat that showed up on a site that was just physically removed. It's an interesting plant in terms of thinking about propagule size. Wheat, we saw it on site, and it's like, oh, look at all that yummy food inside of this propagule. This plant could really explode on this site that just got like a pretty heavy treatment. So you want to make sure, when you're thinking about where to put your energy, it's interesting to sort of pick your poison, I guess. Here you can see Tula flame weeding, a test plot in the monument. Here we saw, sort of from the traits perspective, we saw geophytes respond really strongly, which, when you're burning, this is late spring, I think this is March. When you're burning in March, I think there is a lot of concern for bulbs and geophytes, and man, did the bulbs explode after this. And one sort of, I don't know if it's a bulb grass, Poa bulbosa was the first grass to really recolonize. And I wouldn't say it recolonized, it just never died in this area. This intense amount of burning did not remove this really prolific grass that has a bulb has bulbules in its root system and in its flowering part. So it's very successful at reproduction, rapid reproduction, and its reproductive propagule has a lot of food in it. It's very big and juicy, and it's like very successful, unfortunately. And here's Sean Pride doing a test at the Rogue River Preserve, where we we're testing putting charcoal over the native seeds and doing a light treatment over that. And all of these treatments have really variable responses across heterogeneous landscapes, right? And then you combine them with each other and you increase the variable responses because plants have all of these different parts of their strategies for proliferating on the landscape that you address by, if you burn the surface area kind of light, that plant with an intact root system kind of likes it. If you hand pull the whole thing out, maybe you're changing the long-term trajectory of that plant in a different way. So when we are, seeding these areas after doing some of these treatments, we do have some commonly used species, and most of them are perennial bunch grasses that I've talked about today. And we really thought a lot about getting the annuals in there to occupy space while these little grasses become the big bunch grasses that they can be. It's sort of a 60-40 mix. Here's a great shot of our pollinator mix that has 20 or 30 species in it before we put it on the ground. And here's it taking off quite well in a burn pile at the Collins Experimental Forest. And you can see some of these little bunch grasses are just popping right up. And because this was a burn pile, got totally nuked in the soil, there was no non-native species left. There weren't any native species left either. It was 100% cover of our mix and only our mix. I don't think we saw any Agnathma in the beginning of this trial. So abiotic factors really can define a lot about the system. And unfortunately, we live in an area that just has super variable abiotic factors. So it behooves us to really start figuring out in the same way that the traits are all put together in kind of that PCA matrix framework, it might behoove us to start developing some of these abiotic factors in a more like matrix format. A lot of the literature, I think, really responds to the diversity of lifestyles and the landscapes and factors that we're dealing with. Most of the restoration literature shows that multiple treatment types are needed. And if you think about the variability of lifestyle and all the backup plants that these plants, the grasses primarily, would have, it makes sense that you can't expect one treatment to really deal with any one cohort of non-native grasses. Some of the more successful combinations are fire, mowing, and herbicide. And a lot of this literature comes out of the Willamette Valley that's less water limited. So these variables might change in a more arid system and in our current aridifying climate under climate change. Some of this literature really does highlight that even with fire, mowing, and herbicide, it shouldn't really be seed bank. It should be just previously established perennials do have successes. And that whole diclostem explosion really showed me that in person, I saw it happen. But then, also the non-natives can have a seed bank presence as well. And all of these treatment types and plant lifestyles have interactive effects. And the literature really shows this. I guess I'm not going to get into these graphs too much on the right, just in the interest of time. But this literature also notes that scale is one of the bigger factors. And if you think about scaling up or scaling down, you are increasing or decreasing your heterogeneity on the landscape and increasing or decreasing the complexity of whatever site issues you're trying to deal with in what you're doing. Okay, so some of my references. Hopefully I didn't go too long over. I just want to encourage people to get out there and read about grass and Google about grass and look at the other grass books that your friends are using, because there's a ton of people out there. I just really recommend Agnes Chase for beginners. She's such an approachable writer. And she was one of the first really celebrated agrostologists in the US and was definitely undercredited in the work that she did. I loved this book of Idaho grass and grass-like plants. It breaks out the grasses into some really discernible groups before you start really getting into all the numerous genuses that we have. And then, of course, this Field Guide to the Grasses of Oregon is a spectacular book. There's also, a lot of websites that have information about grasses that you can reference. I just Googled sort of the phylogeny of California grasses and came across a bunch of cool papers. It's just an example here on the far side. It's really interesting. About how, anyways, I won't get too far in there. So I think we'll have a little bit of time for questions. Here's some Melica, I think, on a hillside in the French Flat ACEC with the rare Calicornis that lives there. And here I am up to my waist in some grass with my sidekick. And yeah, I can turn my camera back on if that's helpful. And we can open up the chat for some of the in-person questions if folks are interested.
Hey, Vanessa. We have 13 of us totally engrossed here and wanting to clap. I saw one person clapping, yeah. Yay. And it looks like 14 or so zooming in, which is really awesome. And thanks for talking shop with us and sharing your passion for grasses. Do you want to start with the chat questions and then we'll open it up to folks in the room here? How's that sound? I know it'll take you a moment to look at the chat. Usually we have someone help, but you're pretty good at that too.
Christy's asking what my favorite grass is. Right now it's the dune grasses. Poa macrantha is this, that rhizomatous one just trailing down the dune. And it's kind of like the Elementis elamoides of the sand dune. It has this beautiful like waving inflorescence and it's dioecious. And I've always wondered how there's male and female plants on the dune. And when you think about being in a sand dune, it's like windy and rainy and you're on the coast and like, how is it dioecious? And it's just an interesting lifestyle, and it's a really beautiful plant. In addition, and it's maybe technically in the Rogue Basin, it's like kind of by the Sixes and by Coos Bay and stuff. So that the dune grasses kind of have me right now.
Okay. All right.
I think that's it for questions. Nobody's asking
me questions. Okay. Yeah. Anyone in the room? Caitlyn could come around and bring a microphone to you, or you could come up here and show your face to Vanessa if you have any questions. I know she's very thorough, but yeah. So we have someone here.
Thanks. Don Chu. So a lot of your cons. Yeah. Echo.
So you have to mute one of the computers. I don't think we can hear you. While you guys are sorting out some of the tech,
yeah, he's going to
Christina asked. Oh, okay. Great.
Yeah.
Never mind. Christina, you're next.
Since a lot of your comments are about the work of the Understory Initiative, and I presume your work is to facilitate that, could you tell me about that organization? You know, where their income is from and what they do?
Oh yeah, we're an understory group, and we focus on grasses and wildflower communities and that aspect of habitat restoration. We do a little bit of R&D, but I think we're primarily a group interested in working on the ground restoration projects. We're a grant-funded organization. We do a lot of state and federal grants and some private grants. And I'm like sighing because like grant season is like finally winding down. I think we've been around for 6 years. It was founded by Lilia Steck and Catherine and Sean Prive and Henry Wittridge. And some of the work that we're doing right now in terms of trait analyses, I really have to credit Henry for running a lot of the stats. He's much quicker than I am at coding. And so we do a little bit of back and forth. And between the two of us, I think we have enough brain noodles to figure out how to do the trait analyses in general. So yeah, we really do focus on the broader understory plant spectrum from the coast to the Klamath. And some of our work has started to move into the Umpqua and down into Northern California. That's where I am right now. I'm in Arcata.
Thank you.
So Christina's asking about natives for urban areas and yards. I would always start with the Festukas because they're they take faster as far as natives grow, and I feel like I've had an easier time growing them. They require less maintenance. Some skippers do oviposit on them, and I think the larvae do spend some of their time eating them. If you have any water, I also think tufted turtle hairgrass, while it's totally inappropriate for a yard, is really easy to grow. It's beautiful. It's a great grass. I've had good luck growing that one in the one pot that I'm willing to water more than others. It's kind of a wetland grass. Yeah. I mean, for what purpose? Is it a decorative yard? Is it a pollinator yard? Is it all those things? Festuka.
Anyone else in the room? Don't be shy. It's pretty complex stuff, for sure.
Thank you.
Big thank you. There is one hand. Was there maybe? You mind coming up here if you don't mind? You're a professor. I know you're not shy. Yes. Okay. I feel like I should show you who's in the room. I don't know if you can see very much.
Oh yeah, I want to say hi.
We're a little scattered. Yeah. I appreciate you.
Thanks for coming.
Doing this.
Thank you for coming over.
Here you go.
I'll actually be overly ambitious and ask you 2 questions, Vanessa. So the first thing I was curious about, I loved all the functional trait work that you're doing. And I was curious if you're thinking about root traits at all, because they weren't on the list that you've mentioned. And then the other question I had was with these perennial grasses, if you all look at like seeding them from plugs and like what the analysis is to put down perennial seed as to doing plugs and transplants.
Those are great questions. Root metrics, I mean, it's the first thing that comes up of like what trait is missing from this list. Because if you've ever tried to dig up a grass root, I did my whole master's thesis and I had like 3 plants, like thousands of pots with 3 plants in it, and I had to wash it all out and separate the roots and clip and measure them. And that was in a growth substrate. And that was an actual nightmare. I had to go to the chiropractor for like 4 months after. It was so heinous. Like I moved a ton in an actual 1.5 tons of sand in order to do all that work. And doing that in the field is wildly inaccurate, because if you're going to dig up this whole plot to get the root system out of the ground, you're creating a huge disturbance. It's a super destructive sampling technique, and you're probably not going to get all of it. And in that, like, how would you even transport that much biomass out of the field to wash it and accurately get all of the root and the small root hairs off of it? I think what most of people can do is do greenhouse experiments and sort of like get some kind of like working metrics for how fibrous and expansive a root system is and what the like possible depth is. There are experiments where people just grow like long tubes of grasses and see how far it goes. And it's like, oh, 90% of the biomass is in the upper 6 feet or something. And it's like, okay, well, we were right to not dig that up then, because it's just untenable. I think also, yeah, in my experience, my experiment, I grew them for 70 days and it was like untenable. If you had a plant that was really long lived and maybe 30 years old as a bunch grass, like the ability to dig that up would just be untenable, I guess. So it really is important to think about the root system. In some of the tri-network database, a lot of that information about the root biomass, root to shoot ratios, and some of the resulting growth indices are present. And a lot of that work is somehow there. I wouldn't recommend it for field work, but you can reference these global databases. And in one of the treatments that we did in the monument, we saw that like, what happened? We did a divoting treatment, a burn treatment, and a tarping treatment. And the burn treatment had a really strong, like plants with extensive root response, right? And the tarping treatment had like a really strong geophyte response. And the divot treatment had like a really strong annual response, because in that nice little wet hole, highly acquisitive plants take off immediately. And it was like more Festuka than Agnathma in those as well. So does that kind of answer your question about root stuff?
Yeah. And I'm with you on that. I did a lot of my postdoc washing roots out. So I totally understand the work that goes on.
Well, now it's like a shoot, am I a complainer? I wouldn't do it again, but it's like
me either, really.
It's noble and it's essential, but it's also like in terms of field work, you would have to haul out so much biomass to wash it. And I guess really it's just got to be greenhouse experiments, controlled experiments is where you can get that information from. So in terms of plugs, one of the pictures that I had was Elementis glaucus getting transplanted into table rocks, which just took really well. It was a wet season. The plug got in on time, and someone else grew them and just handed them to us and contracted us. And it's kind of like the dream situation. Again, the field work component of like dealing with all the aspects of restoration, it can't just be really like logistics and labor heavy, and plugs are just not economic. In some species, it's like you can't do anything else because the germination is so low on some plants, or the deer browsing on them is going to be like so heavy that you have to like plug and protect something. Or in the case of trees, I think people do a lot more transplanting, and it makes more sense because you've invested a lot and it's one single tree. But if you want 5,000 milkweeds on the landscape, we've planted like 2,000 milkweeds in a planting event, and you're like, I wish I could sprinkle 10 pounds and there's like a million seeds in there. But milkweed is one of the species where I have doubts about seeding because it's so microhabitat germ responsive. It's actually like seeding is not that successful, but the taproots are really easy to divide and just plop in the ground. So it's case by case, it's funding dependent. And for us, sometimes it's like labor and FTE availability dependent, and who wants to go carry a bag full of plugs up our steep slopes. And it's got to be in wintertime. So it's always kind of a moving target for logistics.
Thank you so much.
Those are great questions. Thank you. Can you talk about IDing and propagating Poa segunda? I feel like that one's, I don't know. I'm curious what Cindy would say about this and some other grasslings. I have a hard time with Poa key sometimes, and other times Poa segunda fits the key. I don't know all the breaks off the top of my head, but I would use the new taxonomies to do it because they're much more thorough in the key breaks. And in our region, I feel like a lot of the POAs are just like mixing California and Oregon, like regions. Propagating it is so easy once you get it going. We grew it in plugs, and the plugs were 9 months old. Plop them on 1 foot spacing down a row. And because they become bushy in production, you don't have to weed that much. It's actually probably another really good one for urban landscapes. It gets kind of bushy in nice conditions. On the landscape, it's kind of hard to see. This is why I don't know the key breaks that well, because I don't key it out that often. Maybe I should. I've keyed it in places where it co-occurs with like piperi and wheeleri, and those are all POAs as well, and they're a little confusing in the places that they occur. I guess in one of those, there's a stem that's just flat and it's easy. But it is in the inflorescence. You have to, it's a small flower also. That's, I think, another part of Poa secunda that is challenging to work through the key, because you have to have these little tiny forceps, and sometimes it's better to just take it home and put it under a dissecting scope and take the time to read it all. It can take a little while to find the right parts for the Poas, the teeny flowered species. That was a great question. Geophytes are bulb plants commonly in the lily family, like Camas and Mariposa lilies. True. Poa, by any other name, is Poa secunda. Yeah. Thanks, Cindy. I will be first in line for your workshop. Thank you.
If Cindy wants to talk, she can unmute or put her video on, but no pressure.
Yeah. And now that we're at
Change
the
the
end, I
setting.
think you can all unmute yourself. And Teresa
Yeah.
changes. Are we done
did.
recording? We can be
Changed.
done recording.
Yeah, if you want, we can stop recording.